Hi everyone, it's Peter Verry, Managing Director of Peloris Global Sourcing, and today I'd just like to share with you my experiences in securing sustainable China market access for Australian food products. Firstly, I'll give you an introduction about my company, a little bit of background. Then we'll talk about the importance of ensuring you have China market strategy thought out. And then we'll close out with some considerations on China market access and the relevant compliance issues that need to be addressed. So, Peloris, established in 2011, and we have offices in Australia, Malaysia, and China. China is our primary focus. We provide effectively a paddock-to-plate China market access solution for premium foods and beverages. Now, we specialise in cold chain logistics and border clearance for short shelf life perishable foods. And I guess we made our name in pioneering the China Green Lane border clearance for fresh milk back in 2014. We've got fast-track border clearance protocols in place with 3 China ports. That's Shanghai, Suzhou, which is just inland from Shanghai, and Chongqing, which is way west. To date, we've successfully imported over 3 million litres of fresh milk into China, and we've had, in that time, 0 quality or compliance failures. A little bit about me and my business colleague. My background is finance and supply chain, and I've spent a lot of time working in Asia for multinational corporations, so very familiar with the region. However, would not be successful in China without my good friend and colleague Alex Wong, who we met in business in Asia and have successfully set up Peloris. So, onward to China market strategy. So, we've found, and again, this is just my opinion, and my views, but it is really important to understand the market. So, the way we've looked at this is that we considered the social imperatives, so clean and green. Clean and green used to be the minimum requirement. Sorry, it was the major requirement back in the day when we started, but it's now the minimum requirement because the Chinese consumer is very sophisticated, and their expectation now is clean and green is the minimum, and biodynamic and organic and social responsibility. All these elements come into play with the Chinese consumer. Health and safety, of course, is paramount. There are regular scandals in China still, and food health and safety is one of the key drivers for imported foods. And associated with that is product provenance. So product provenance is really important. There is always a preference for authentic imports, that is the original labels, as opposed to private labels, although they do sell. And also, if it is a product that is selling in Australian retail outlets, that's also considered very favourably by the consumer. So commercial imperatives, quality assurance. So product quality is really important, but you shouldn't just focus on production. If it's a temperature-sensitive product or a perishable type product, it's really important to make sure the cold chain is properly controlled as well to ensure that the product arrives at the consumer in the best of condition. Traceability. There's a lot of talk around blockchain and many things like this, but really there is a real benefit if you can provide traceability down to the unit level for the consumer, because this is a point of difference. And imported foods are very expensive typically, and the consumer wants to be sure that they're getting the real deal. And of course, cost effectiveness. So the CHAFTA has been instrumental. The China-Australia Free Trade Agreement has been instrumental in increasing commercial competitiveness with Australian products competing against the rest of the world. However, total cost of ownership also needs to be considered. And there will be times when it's just not going to be cost effective to be able to import and sell a product in China. So it just needs to be considered early on as part of your strategy. Political imperatives. As I mentioned, the free trade agreement has been very successful in freeing up trade in the sense of making it more competitive. However, there have been some other initiatives as well driven by the Chinese. In fact, cross-border e-commerce is a really viable option, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. And free trade zones as well, which goes along with that. Transparency. So China's pushing transparency very hard. Has been for several years now, a crackdown on corruption, and China customs themselves, we have observed, have moved from a transaction management focus where every shipment is being micromanaged through to a more of a process management approach. And there's also a very strong focus on ensuring China consumer rights are protected. So this includes anti-counterfeit measures, and these have been introduced with the recent rollout of the China e-commerce law, which I will talk about later. And it's really important that there's truth in labelling and also truth in advertising. There are heavy fines if brands are advertised in China with incorrect information. And there's also been a strengthened supervision of China domestic supply chain and product handling in the market, which can ultimately come back to affect the brand owners' access to markets. I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So it's also important that you identify your stakeholders and their expectations. So who are your stakeholders? Typically, we identified our stakeholders as the brand owner and the consumer, and our job is to connect them, but also the regulatory authorities, because there's also an expectation that we will connect them in a way that is fully compliant. Interestingly enough, if you look at the brand owner and consumer expectations, they are really two sides of the same coin. So if you look at the brand owner, they want to make sure their brand reputation is protected in the market. And similarly, the consumer is expecting, that the product that they are buying is safe and healthy and is 100% from the brand owner's production or farm. In terms of the regulatory expectations, you'll see this a lot in this webinar: accountability and responsibility. So the authorities in China are very strong on ensuring accountability and responsibility, and many of the changes to the e-commerce law have focused on tightening up where this has been lacking. Product and label compliance. So again, consumer protection, they want to make sure that the product, the ingredients and formulation is compliant with their prescribed standards and that the label is accurate. And shipment compliance, so export, import documentation, everything is compliant and accurate. And of course, traceability and transparency is just as important to them as it is to the brand owner. So, developing an export strategy. This is surprisingly, we find quite a few products going into China without a clearly defined export strategy. You could argue that almost every strategy is about risk and return. So the way that we approached this is we thought, okay, to ensure a return on our investment, what were our key drivers? So we identified our drivers as brand positioning. So we wanted the products in China to be positioned as premium. We didn't want to be in a price-taking type situation or a commodity type situation. So that ensured that was a healthy profit margin. And we also wanted to make sure that we had a market share of the right segment. So 1.4 billion Chinese. We weren't targeting that. Imported product is expensive, and it's important to identify your specific market segment. And then it's just a matter of working out which enablers will ensure those drivers will drive those the way you want them. So product distribution, for example, it may or may not be beneficial to be online or offline or both. That's a decision that you need to make in terms of where you want your brand to be sitting in the market, as an example. And in terms of risk mitigation, obviously brand reputation has to be managed. Product quality is really important, and also financial security. If I just take brand reputation as an example, you've got to make sure that you are fully compliant, because any non-compliant shipment, you will be publicly identified on a China customs blacklist, which I will talk about a little later as well. Market position. So really, it's important, depending on your product, where do you want it to sit in the market. So the Chinese distributor's default position is usually price, and it is easy for a product to be commoditized, but it's really difficult to then reinstate it as a premium product. So it's really, if you're sending over, let's say, milk powder, UHT milk, it's already been commoditized and it's largely sold in the market on price. There are exceptions. So A2 obviously has done a good job in developing a premium for its unique point of difference. But if you've got a finite resource in Australia and you're producing a premium product and it's going to a large demand, you should make sure that you have the elements in place to make sure that that stays a premium in the market. Not easy though. All right, move on to China market access. This is really the core of this webinar, but it is important that the China market strategy has been thought through, because it will impact on the market access requirements that you have to address. So the first thing I always say to suppliers and brand owners is you must understand the China food import regulations. Don't rely on a third-party partner in China to be doing the right thing. They may inadvertently think they are doing the right thing, but they may not be. And the bottom line is the brand owner will always be responsible for compliance. No matter that ownership has been transferred to the importer or the distributor, responsibility for compliance remains with the brand owner. So it only makes sense that brand owners have a very good first-hand knowledge of the China food import regulations. And there are two key laws. So the China Food Safety Law 2015 is the main one. It was described at the time it was introduced as the strictest food safety law in Chinese history. Basically, it's important that you become very familiar with this. And if you're not sure, seek specialist advice on any of the clauses that you think may affect your imports. And secondly, if you're looking at e-commerce, you really need to make sure you're familiar with the e-commerce law 2018, implemented on the 1st of January 2019. These two laws cover 90% of the requirements. There are a few special provisions relating to very specific medical type products, etc., but this covers the majority of food imports into China. Selecting the optimal China import pathway is the next step in the process, I would suggest. There are two import pathways. One is general trade, which I'm going to talk about now, and the other is cross-border e-commerce, which I will talk about on the next slide. Technically, you could argue there is a third pathway, which is the personal post channel, which is typically used by the Daigo, who buys product in the shops here and sends it home to family and friends, but I'm not going to talk about that today. So walking through the steps, the very first step for general trade is product compliance. I should mention too, general trade is the only pathway you can use if you want to do business to business. So if you are selling into retail outlets, food service businesses, or etc., then you have no choice. It's got to go by general trade, because only sales to consumer can go through the cross-border e-commerce pathway. So product compliance is the first step, and this can be quite straightforward or quite complicated depending on the product. Typically, there are three elements to this. There's entity compliance. So in some cases, the processing plant in Australia has to be accredited by the Chinese Accreditation Authority, CNCA, but not always. And also, entity compliance also means the China entity. So a distributor looking to buy your product must be registered to licensed, to manage food handling for that particular food category. So as a brand owner, again, the responsibility is on you to check that your partner in China is suitably licensed, or any problems will come back to affect your market development. So product compliance, label compliance is, again, these are prescribed by the China, what they call the GB standards. They describe the requirements, and the label requirements are very prescriptive and very exact, and tend to be port specific. So a label approved by one port, let's say Shanghai, may or may not be able to be imported through Beijing without any changes, but there is a chance that Beijing Port Authority may interpret the label formatting differently. So it's always wise to make sure you go through the process separately for each port. Export logistics, so for general trade, that could be by sea or by air, depending on the nature of the product. And of course, considerations for this is supply chain lead times and management, if it's a perishable product, temperature sensitive. Storage and handling, so the product obviously goes into bonded storage until it's cleared, and customs clearance will apply the relevant tariffs and taxes, which must be paid before the product can leave the bonded zone storage. In parallel to that, there will also be potentially some compliance testing. So your shipment may be selected for testing. As I mentioned before, it's more the Chinese Inspection and Quarantine Bureau is moving more from a transaction focus to a process focus. So there are now random tests selected as opposed to every single shipment being tested, and it will be randomly selected and tested according to the relevant standards, and that includes label testing, checking the label to make sure it's right. And then only once that testing is finished will that shipment be given a China health certificate. Of course, if it's not tested, it will be given a health certificate after customs clearance. But if it is selected for testing, be aware it could delay border clearance by up to a week, depending on the nature of the tests that have to be undertaken. And then it goes to product distribution. Product distribution typically is the shipment is picked up or delivered to your distribution partner in China, and from there out to the relevant customer retail outlets that they might be servicing. Moving on to cross-border e-commerce, there's been a lot of interest in this, and there have been some significant changes in this in the last 12 months as well in the regulations. It is actually a good option for some products, and the process here is two options. There's the pick and pack at origin, and then there's the pick and pack at destination. The pick and pack at origin is simply the online orders are basically assembled and picked and packed and then shipped out individually. When they arrive in China, they have to be still cleared through customs, but there is no tariff and there is a reduced VAT tax. and then they are delivered to the customer. Points to note here in the customer order: individual transaction and annual spend limits apply, and the consumer has to be able to provide their ID to be able to complete the order. So it's very much business to customer, B2C. The pick and pack at origin, the considerations for export for brand owners needs to be, there are perhaps some more production flexibility if you are warehousing in country of origin as opposed to sending it all over to bonded storage and then waiting for the orders to come in. You may find that provides more flexibility. However, that might be offset by differences in storage and handling costs. Every situation is unique and needs to be just modelled. This is just an example of the areas that you should take into consideration when choosing which is the pathway that suits your business, your export strategy. So pick and pack, of course, similarly, pick and pack costs in China might be significantly less than in Australia. I'm not sure, but that could be a factor. And of course, the most important thing is customer delivery lead time. So if it's pick and pack in China and the product's already sitting in China, there's a significant reduction in lead time for the consumer if that is a problem, if that is a feature of your service offering. But again, it's a trade-off. So export logistics, sending the product over in bulk for pick and pack at destination is obviously more cost-effective in terms of economies of scale than sending over individual customer orders from the country of origin. Again, it just depends on the nature of the product. I will say that for cold chain products, temperature-sensitive products, pick and pack at origin is not an option because it's just not going to work from a product quality control and cost-effectiveness point of view. Tariffs and taxes, so I mentioned that before, for cross-border e-commerce they are less, but note that the chapter tariff reductions that have been in place for several years now means that the differential between the tariffs for the tariff that is for goods coming through general trade and the cross-border taxes is getting less and less. And then last mile delivery. There's a number of organisations in China that organise last mile delivery, and they're a lot better than they were 5 years ago, a lot more reliable. But there is still some immaturity in the cold chain delivery in China. So brand owners should be very careful to understand the process and make sure they've got transparency over the quality of their product. So managing non-tariff measures, I've mentioned that several times now. So the non-tariff measures are typically grouped into four. I've grouped them into four for ease of reference. So entity compliance. So, your legal structure. Are you going to be setting up a company, a WOFE in China, or are you going to be partnering with a third party? These are the considerations that you need to be looking at now before commencing shipments. Licenses, accreditations, make sure the entities are relevant entities are appropriately licensed. Intellectual property is really important. It's really important that your brand is registered in China because China has a first file rule. So even if someone is not importing your product, they can register your brand and you can't do much about it. So it's really important to do that even before you do sampling or product promotions in China. Infrastructure and facilities, so especially if you're shipping temperature sensitive products, make sure that all along the supply chain that there are relevant facilities and suitable facilities in place, cool rooms, refrigerated vehicles, whatever is required. In terms of product compliance, I mentioned before, ingredients have to be approved, and that's typically a process that happens between governments. So if a product like, say, blueberries, for example, from Australia is not allowed to go to China at this point. For that to happen, there has to be protocols put in place and agreement between the China government and Australian government. Product formulation is usually dictated by the GB standards, so it will prescribe certain requirements for the whatever the percentage of various ingredients in the actual formulation which need to be met. And labelling is also formatting and content, and in particular certain words on the label are not allowed. So if you are calling a product natural, pure, or the word organic, for example, these are all red flags. They may or may not, well, organic won't be allowed unless your organisation has been accredited by China, and some of those other words, unless you can prove it, it won't be allowed. So it's a very literal interpretation of the wording on the label. Shipment compliance, product testing, as I mentioned, randomly selected shipments for testing in most categories, but not all. Some may not be. And the percentage of testing depends on the product category. Export preparation, if it's temperature sensitive, you have to make sure that the product temperature and the quality of the product is not compromised during transit. Export import documentation, really important. The slightest error, the slightest a different word on two documents can be enough to delay the shipment, and in some cases even cause the shipment to be abandoned. And customs and quarantine clearance is also can be quite bureaucratic. Some ports are better than others, so you just need to understand the process and the timelines that are involved to make sure that you can actually get product into China with a commercially viable shelf life. Market compliance is not really so much compliance, but market, I guess, requirements is, as I talked about before, product provenance is really important. Consumers in China are among the most sophisticated consumers in the world, in my opinion, and they are more and more requiring evidence that what they're buying is real. They also they don't trust their own locally produced food in many cases, and also a lot of the online offerings, they have doubts about the quality or the authenticity of that as well. Supply chain transparency, again, this just goes towards proving that the product integrity is strong and hasn't been compromised from factory to their door. And product recall. So China Customs also requires that brand owners, the importers in the first instance, but brand owners by default, have a suitable and acceptable product recall process in place. Finally, understanding the consequences of non-compliance. So, whilst many media reports tend to indicate that China operates in a random and unpredictable manner, that's not actually my experience. My experience is that every action is dictated by a relevant law that they feel has been compromised, and there is actually a process of escalation. So in the first instance, if a shipment is non-compliant for whatever reason, it will go on what they call the CIQ blacklist, which is a monthly published spreadsheet of every shipment around the world, the reason, the brand name, the reason it was rejected, etc. If a particular brand or importer appears on that list frequently or several times, then they can be escalated to a strengthened supervision, which means that they will increase the rate of testing. So from, let's say it might have been 10%, they might take it up to 50% of every shipment coming through that importer will be tested, until such a point they feel that remedial action has happened and they can go back to normal supervision. And then there's the next level, which is basically every single shipment will be tested. regardless. So if they feel that the systemic issues have not been addressed, then every single shipment will be tested, which has a very detrimental effect on clearance times and also cost, because the cost of that testing will be going back to the importer. And of course, the ultimate sanction is suspension of your import license. And there's been some notable cases in the last 2 years in Australia in the dairy industry where import licenses have been suspended, not through the actions of the producer, whose production process was fine, but through the actions of the importer and or distributor, whatever that might be. Maybe it's been poor product management, documentation errors, whatever it might be. It's typically something serious. It's usually to do with temperature control or food health and safety. To result in suspension, it has to be of that sort of significance. To the right here, it's a bit hard to see, but you've got a couple of examples. The blacklist is in the background, which you can't see, unfortunately, but the front document is actually a certificate of analysis report from Australia that has been doctored. So this is just as an example. So you can see the production date at the top has been listed as the 10th of May 2018, but they've forgotten to change the dates down below, which shows the 3rd of May, and it's even in the Australian date format. And this is a case where a certificate of analysis for the shipment the week before has been used to clear the shipment for the current week. Totally illegal, and I suspect that the Australian producer had no idea that this is happening, but the actions like this could result in that producer losing their license. I just use that as an example that you really must have transparency about what is going on. So that brings me to the end of this webinar, and I'd like to thank you very much. I hope it's been of some use to you, and good luck with your future exports. Bye.